By the end of this video, you should be able to identify properties and changes as physical or chemical, identify properties as extensive or intensive, and identify data as quantitative or qualitative. A physical change is a characteristic that is not associated with a change in chemical composition, whereas a chemical property is the ability or inability to change chemical composition. Properties can also be classified as extensive or intensive. Extensive properties depend on the amount of matter present. For example, the mass, volume, or heat associated with a given sample. If I take a sample and I divide it in half, the mass changes, the volume changes, and the heat content of that sample also changes. They're all divided by 2. So extensive properties are directly proportional to the amount of matter that is present. An intensive property does not depend on the amount of matter. So density, which is mass divided by volume, if I take my sample and divide it in half, I have half the mass and half the volume. So the mass and the volume, both extensive properties, change, but the density, the ratio between the mass and the volume, does not change. Which type of property would be more useful for identifying a substance? Intensive properties are generally more useful in identifying a substance. For example, the density. However, temperature is also an intensive property. If I divide my sample in half, the temperature doesn't change. But that's not something that can be used to identify a substance. Next, we have 2 different types of data. There's quantitative data and there's qualitative data. Quantitative data is a quantity. It has numbers and units associated with it. So quantitative data would be, for example, something is 50 centimeters long or has a mass of 15 grams. Some things we can't really give quantitative data for. There's also qualitative data, which is also useful. It has no numbers. For example, the object is blue, or it's short. Well, short is probably not the best way to record something like that. You'd want to actually measure it. Or heavy, you would want to find the mass of something. Always be as specific as possible. But sometimes there are times where qualitative data is actually what we're looking for. But again, be as specific as possible.